Klaus Windamier, former tactician of the 3rd Highland Army and the current Chancellor of the Dunan Republic. Klaus received plenty of screen time in Suikoden 2, more than many, but much to the disappointment of many of his fans, he didn't play as big of a role as he probably should have. Fans of his will be happy to know that he received a short story titled Hope in the Darkness, which was included in the Genso Suikoden Short Story Collection 3, a book that released in Japan in December 2001. This short story takes place around 5 years before the events of Suikoden 2 when Klaus is 14 years old. It covers how Klaus began accompanying his father on assignments and how he decided to become a tactician. This is a somewhat long short story, it's just under 60 pages. It's packed with lore about his family, the Highland Kingdom, the Highland Royal Army, and the war between Highland and the city-states that involved Tonin Genkaku. The story also provides some lore about Harmonia that the vast majority of you haven't heard before. Chapter 1. The story begins with Klaus waking up in excitement. He looked out the window of his bedroom on the 2nd floor of the Windamier mansion. The city of Lorenwi was covered in a morning mist and not a single person could be seen on the silent streets. Normally when Klaus woke up, he couldn't get out of bed so easily, but today was different. Today would be his first time accompanying his father on an assignment. Klaus got dressed and looked to the rucksack and sword at the foot of his bed, which he had packed the night before to prepare him for the day. The sun started to rise and Klaus once again looked out the window. He spotted a platoon of 30 men galloping on horseback down the street, being led by his father, Klaus Windamier, the general of the 3rd Highland Army. Klaus heard a knock on his bedroom door and his mother Eliza entered to greet him. She noticed Klaus was up unusually early and saw how excited he was to accompany his father. She told Klaus she'd go and get ready to see him off, but stopped mid-sentence to cover her mouth as she let out a dry cough. Eliza was a frail and sickly woman who had been ill for the last 2 years and was advised by her doctors to concentrate on her treatments. It is said that Klaus inherited his looks and slender physique from his mother. Klaus told her not to push herself too hard and asked her to go back to bed and get some rest as she doesn't need to worry about him. Eliza placed her hand on her chest to suppress her coughs and told Klaus that today is an important day for him so she can't sleep through it. Klaus tried to argue, but Eliza shut him down and reminded him that the Windamier family have a history of military service, and as his mother, it's her duty to see him off as he's going to the battlefield for the first time. Eliza forced a smile, but Klaus thought what she said was a little over the top as there hadn't been any battles in recent memory and the war between Highland and the city-states ended over 20 years ago. Klaus told his mother that he'll only be acting as his father's attendant while they deliver supplies to camps along the border. Eliza responded by telling Klaus that he's now 14 and it's time he started thinking about what path he wants to take in life. He told his mother that his mind is already made up and he wants to become a general of the Highland Army, just like his father. Eliza responded that it's a good idea, but in a solemn tone she questioned Klaus if that was really what he wanted. Klaus seemed to understand what his mother was saying. Just like his mother, Klaus was also born with a frail body. Even though he had received training in swordsmanship since he was a small child, he never showed much improvement and he never won a single sparring match against his friends. Klaus preferred to read and immerse himself in books in his room rather than going outside. Eliza wanted to support her son's desire to follow in his father's footsteps, but she was also worried about him as the battlefield is a place without mercy, and someone like Klaus would surely be among the first to be killed. Klaus gave his mother a smile to ease her fears and once again looked out the window. His father's platoon was now close to their home. Klaus turned to his mother and told her that it's his dream to join the Highland Royal Army and that he's going to do his best to become just like his father. And even if he can't become a general, he wants to fight by his father's side on the battlefield. Eliza straightened Klaus's collar and told him that if that's the path he wants to take, she supports him. She encouraged him to follow the path he set out for himself and not to regret his choices. Klaus thanked his mother for her words and heard a loud voice call out to him from the street. He grabbed his things and left the room with his mother. The two walked down the stairs and Kiba was standing outside the entrance telling him that they'd depart now. Klaus's whole body trembled at the sight of his father in his armour and he wondered if one day he could be like his father. Klaus called him father but quickly corrected himself and called him General Kiba and told him that he's ready to leave. The story then provides a short description of Kiba and the 3rd Highland Army. Kiba is a well-known general in the Highland Army who first rose to fame in the war with the city-states over 20 years ago. His heroics in battle would quickly see him rise through the ranks until he eventually became the general of the 3rd Highland Army. The 3rd Highland Army is mainly responsible for providing logistical and strategic support to the other armies, but was also expected to engage the enemy in battle when the need arose. During the war with the city-states over 20 years ago, Kiba had been assigned to transport troops to the camp established on the border, but on many occasions he went to the front line and took command to repel the city-state soldiers. When Kiba was off duty and with his family, he was considered to be quite a normal father and husband. Patting Klaus's head and ruffling his hair and showering his wife Eliza with rugged but heartfelt praise and affection. His only flaw was that he drank heavily. Today, Kiba had been assigned to transport supplies to the Highland camps near their border with the city-states. Klaus called his father General, but Kiba corrected him, telling him that he's his father and only those who officially serve under him address him as General. Kiba's response made both Klaus and Eliza smile. Kiba told Klaus that he's glad he's trying to become a general, and told him of how when he was his age, it was his dream to ride on the battlefield with his father, but his father died on the battlefield before his dream could come true, and his new dream is to ride on the battlefield with Klaus. Klaus's heart began to pound with excitement, as that was exactly what Klaus had dreamed of, but Kiba's face soon turned serious, and with a stern look and a loud voice, he told Klaus that the road to becoming a general is long and hard, and asked him if he's prepared for that. Klaus assured him that he is, and that he doesn't intend to taint the name of the Windamier family by failing, that he'd like to start as a soldier and work his way up to becoming a general, just as his father did. Kiba told Klaus that it's a good plan, and Eliza told Kiba to take care of their son. Kiba assured her that he will, and set her mind at ease by telling her that all he'll be doing today is delivering food and clothing to the camps near the border. He then asked her how she was feeling, and wondered why she wasn't in bed resting. Eliza responded that she's feeling better thanks to the doctor's medicine. Kiba told her not to overdo it and that he's glad she's had Klaus with her, but he's reluctant to leave her home alone in her current condition. Eliza told him not to worry, that she's been preparing for this day. She then told Kiba that she received a letter from her brother the other day and he's coming to visit. Kiba was relieved to hear that she'd have company, and then turned to Klaus and told him that it's time to go. As Kiba and Klaus readied to leave, a man's rough voice could be heard calling out to them from the gate, saying thank goodness he made it in time. Kiba and Klaus turned to the gate and saw a man with short hair tied up in a brown bandana and wearing a well-worn leather breastplate with a cloak and a slender sword at his waist, shuffling his way through the soldiers. Kiba called out Master Greg and asked him what distant lands he has journeyed to this time. Greg is Eliza's older brother and Klaus's uncle. Greg is the captain of a defence force in a town on the edge of the Holy Kingdom of Harmonia, and he would often travel to the Highland Kingdom to visit his sister. Klaus commented it's been a while and thanked Greg for coming to see his mother. Greg walked up to him with a smile and told him it's only natural for a big brother to want to see his baby sister. He told Klaus he's glad he made it in time, as he heard today would be his first day riding with his father and he wanted to celebrate. Klaus responded that it's not a big deal and he's worried that he'll slow his father down. Greg asked him what he was saying and told him that such humility will not be forgiven on the battlefield, that he needs to keep his head up and have some pride or he'll be disrespected by both enemies and allies alike. Greg then began to rummage through his bag and said to Klaus that he wanted to bring him a gift to congratulate him on his first mission. He then pulled out a ragged old book with brownish sheets of paper. Klaus looked at the book and was surprised to read the title, Heroes of Harmonia. It was a rare book that chronicled the exploits of many brave Harmonian generals. It was a fascinating book to read for its historical military tales, but it could also be studied as a tactical book thanks to its faithful and detailed depictions. Because of how popular the book was, many adaptations were made by later generations who altered and dramatized its contents for each region it was published in. Klaus had already read a version of the book from an author from Highland who altered the contents of the book to focus purely on martial exploits. The copy of the book he received from his uncle Greg was one of the few surviving original copies. Greg asked him what he thinks and told Klaus that he bought it from an antique dealer and it was quite expensive, but how could he resist buying such a gift for his precious nephew? He told Klaus that if he reads this book, he'll become a better general than the one standing before him. Kiba jokingly told Klaus not to listen to him, and he and Greg engaged in some light banter. Klaus was speechless. He didn't know what to say for receiving such a precious gift. Greg told him not to worry, that he's very well paid despite how he looks. Judging by Greg's appearance and the armor he was wearing, Klaus knew that his uncle wasn't very well paid. Klaus bowed deeply and handed the book to his mother, asking her to take it to his room. Kiba told Greg that they planned to return in about 10 days, and when they do, they should have a drink together. The two shook hands and Greg replied that he's looking forward to it. Klaus waved goodbye to his mother and uncle as he and Kiba headed towards the gates as Chapter 1 comes to an end. Chapter 2. Kiba, Klaus and 30 soldiers set out to join a convoy that was gathering outside of the castle. The convoy consisted of about 200 well-armed soldiers and a man named Delens. Delens had been a subordinate of Kiba's for a long time and now serves as the vice commander of the 3rd Highland Army. He's a tall and muscular man of considerable strength who wears full plate armour and a horned helmet. He's considered to be a master of the broad axe and meteor hammer and is said to be a sight to behold on the battlefield. Kiba would often invite Delens back to his house for drinks whenever the two returned to Rennes. He was also Klaus's sword instructor and advised Klaus to wield a rapier due to his slender physique. Just a little side lore about Delens. Delens also appeared in the Suikoden 2 novelization where he still served as the vice commander of the 3rd Highland Army, though he died in the story while sacrificing himself to save Kiba. Unfortunately, he isn't mentioned in any of the encyclopedias or games, so the chances of Konami acknowledging his existence in the future is quite slim. The soldiers in the convoy initially gave Klaus special treatment as he was the son of Kiba, but Klaus refused their treatment and wanted to be recognized as a fellow soldier as he felt he could learn a lot by spending time with them. Klaus joined the soldiers in setting up tents and preparing meals, and even sat by the fire with them. He quickly became close with many of the soldiers, and during this time, Klaus was able to get to know his father more deeply as a general as the soldiers shared many stories of him. In battle, Kiba always took the lead and led from the front lines, and when the battle was over, he gave out praise and prizes to his men. Kiba himself would refuse any compensation or spoils of war, instead offering it to the families of soldiers who had lost their lives in battle. The soldiers spoke about Kiba with pride and respect, saying that they entrust their lives to him not only because they adore his heroism, but also his personality. Delens then chimed in and told Klaus in a low voice that Kiba takes good care of his men and he understands that battles can't be fought alone, just like the country can't be maintained alone, and in that regard he's very different from the prince. Bit of Luca Blight slander there. Hearing all of the soldiers' words, Klaus became even more proud of his father for building such a strong relationship with his men and hopes to one day catch up and overtake him. After 2 days of travel, Kiba and his men approached the border with Muse. Klaus spotted the wall that bordered the two countries in the distance and excitedly commented that they'd finally arrived. Kiba asked Klaus if he knows where their camp near the border is based. Klaus scanned the area and spotted a dense forest that led to a mountain near the border, and beyond the forest he could spot the roof of a wooden structure at the top of a small mountain. He commented that the camp must be located in the forest on the left side of the border gate, as if something goes wrong at the gate, they can go to the rescue immediately, and even if an army breaks through the gate, they could be attacked on their flanks. Kiba commented he's right, that there's around 3,000 soldiers camped in the forest, and complimented Klaus for his judgment. Klaus then asked him what the wooden building on the mountain is. He thinks it's a fort, but he's not sure as he can't see it properly. With a nostalgic, complicated expression on his face, Kiba replied that it's Reto Fortress, an old fort that's no longer in use. Klaus asked his father if he'd ever been stationed there, and Kiba responded that he was over 20 years ago. Just as Kiba was about to say more, a group of around 30 men emerged from the forest, and the man leading the group waved at Kiba. Kiba told Klaus that they're here to escort them to the camp, and he'll tell him about the fort when he has some free time. He advised Klaus to stick with Delens while he's gone. Klaus replied that he understands as Kiba gave instructions to his men and rode towards the group that emerged from the forest. Klaus got the impression that his father didn't really want to tell him about the fort. He looked at his father and then turned to look at Retto Fortress in the mountain and got a strange feeling. Many of his father's heroic feats had already been told to him, however, he had never heard the name Retto Fortress, and the expression on his father's face was one he had never seen before. Klaus snapped out of his thoughts when he heard Delenz calling out to him. Delenz asked him why he didn't go with his father, and Klaus replied that his father told him to stay with him. Delenz suggested that they take it easy. Klaus then asked Delenz if he knows about Retto Fortress. Delenz opened his eyes wide in surprise and looked at Klaus as if he just said something he shouldn't know about. Klaus asked him what happened there, but Delenz told him that it's a story his father should tell him. Klaus noticed that Delenz had a similar reaction to his father, and his curiosity grew as the mystery of the fort grew deeper. Klaus pressed the matter and said he heard that his father was stationed there and wanted to know what happened. Delenz replied that since Klaus has made up his mind to become a general, he can tell him, but asked him to wait a moment. Delenz then turned to his men and sent the convoy ahead to the camp while he stayed behind to speak to Klaus. Delenz began telling Klaus the story of a war that took place over 20 years ago between the Highland Kingdom and the city-states of Joustin. At the order of King Robert Blight, the Highland Royal Army, led by Han Cunningham, invaded the city-states. Thanks to the poor leadership of Darrell of Mews, the Highland Army saw many early victories and controlled large portions of the city-states. But the situation changed drastically and the Highland Army began being pushed back when a man called Genkaku arrived and took up leadership of the Joustin army. Klaus interjected and said that he already knew that part of the story as it's a famous war, but he can't believe there was someone who could stand against and defeat Han Cunningham. Delenz said he agrees, but it's a fact that Han was defeated. Delenz continued by saying that the Highland Army lost many generals and officers thanks to their many defeats in the latter half of the war. It was around that time that Kiba, who hailed from a prominent military family, was promoted and entrusted with a small force of 200 men despite only being 19 at the time. Kiba and his men departed Luanhui after being ordered to deploy in Mews where the fighting still continued fiercely. Halfway to the border, a messenger arrived and informed Kiba that King Robert's troops had been defeated by Genkaku and were retreating to Mews while being pursued. All troops in the vicinity were ordered to go to the rescue. As soon as Kiba heard the message, he ordered all of his troops to Mews immediately. However, when they arrived at the border, they met an officer who was fleeing after losing his troops. The officer explained that they rushed to rescue King Robert as ordered, but the Joustin soldiers were lying in wait to ambush relief forces. Genkaku's plan was to use King Robert as bait to annihilate all relief forces. Learning of the enemy's strategy, Kiba kept his men near the border. He wanted to rush to King Robert's aid, but he didn't want to throw away the lives of the men he had been entrusted with. He also knew that King Robert was surrounded by the best men in the royal army, and no matter what, they'd fight to get him across the border. Kiba decided to prepare for a battle near the border and ordered his men to Retto Fortress. Many of the older soldiers were reluctant to follow Kiba into what they believed was certain death, and half of the men deserted. Only 100 men remained. 2 days later, Kiba spotted King Robert's troops approaching the border, being pursued by 3,000 Joustin soldiers. As soon as they crossed the border, Kiba ordered 50 men to raise flags in the fort and ring gongs and bells. Kiba then charged down the hill with the other 50 men. The sudden sight and sound of what the Joustin forces believed to be a Highland army caused them to panic and temporarily disrupted their ranks. Having bought enough time for King Robert to escape, Kiba returned to the fort. The fighting continued, and by the time the sun had set, the Joustin forces retreated. Klaus let out a sigh. There was no such story in the memoirs covering the war, and he wondered why his father didn't tell him about having achieved such a huge feat. Delenz explained that Kiba is pained by the memory, as almost all of his men were killed during the battle. Delenz added that King Robert tried to award Kiba for his service, but Kiba declined. Klaus remembered his father's expression from earlier. The fact that Kiba was more pained by the loss of his men than he was happy with the victory made him even more fascinated by his father. Klaus looked up at Retto Fortress. The fortress was now dilapidated, but to Klaus it was like a medal sparkling in the sun. Klaus and Delenz made their way towards the Highland camp. Tired from the trip, Kiba ordered his men to spend the night with the border guards to get some rest before departing to deliver supplies to the camp along the border with the Matilda Knightum. As Klaus and Delenz sat by the fire eating dinner, Klaus kept looking over at his father and thought about Reto Fortress. He wondered what would have happened if he was in the same position his father was. He knew he wasn't as strong or as brave as his father, and that it was probably his father's bravery that allowed him to attempt such a strategy. Klaus's thoughts of his father didn't stop. He was happy to learn what a wonderful man and general his father was, but he also felt the gap between himself and his father was bigger than he imagined. There could be things that Klaus could learn and obtain through effort and experiences, but he felt that bravery was a natural talent and something that would be difficult for him to achieve. Delenz asked Klaus what it's been like accompanying his father so far. Klaus replied with a smile, saying that he only knew his father from home, but he's been pleasantly surprised at learning what an amazing person he is. Delenz responded by saying that he's known Kiba for a long time and he's still amazed by his courage. He told Klaus that his father is a special person and there are not many blessed with his talents, but his father is far from perfect and he has some flaws too. Klaus asked what flaws does his father have, and Delenz jokingly replied that he's terrible at paperwork and administrative duties and that he's probably dripping in greasy sweat right now in the tent. Delenz joked that he normally takes care of the paperwork on Kiba's behalf, but Kiba is overdoing it to show off in front of Klaus. Delenz's words comforted Klaus, but he worried a little that his presence was distracting his father from his work. Klaus suggested that Delenz go help his father. Delenz grabbed a torch and the two walked towards Kiba's tent. As the two made their way towards Kiba's tent, a voice called out, "Isn't that Kiba's son?" It was dark and Klaus couldn't really tell, but there were three men sitting by a campfire and he could swear one of them was looking at him with contempt. Klaus tried to get through the situation lightly by thanking the men for their hard work and how grateful he is for them protecting the peace of Highland. The men invited him to sit with them, but snarkily commented that the son of Lord Kiba wouldn't sit with people of a lower social class. Klaus looked closely and noticed that the three soldiers were grinning at him. He felt that as they were guests in the camp, he couldn't refuse their invitation. Klaus and Delenz sat by the fire and noticed that the soldiers had small cups in their hands. Highland camps functioned under a 3-shift system, with each shift lasting 8 hours. Following each shift, soldiers were given a small ration of alcohol. Klaus had a bad feeling about the men and wanted to leave as soon as possible, but the men asked him questions in rapid succession. They wanted to know how old he was, what was his military experience, what kind of weapon did he carry, and wondered if he could ride a horse. Klaus soon grew tired of their questions as he realized they were attempting to make fun of him. The soldiers' final question made Klaus feel uncomfortable. They asked him when will he become an officer, that surely the noble son of General Kiba could become an officer without having any experience or taking any exams. Klaus believed that the soldiers were jealous of him and his upbringing. After a moment of silence, Klaus politely retorted that he doesn't intend on taking advantage of his family name, and that he wants to start at the bottom and work his way up through the ranks on his own merit. One of the men replied that Klaus is funny, that it's strange to abandon the easy path and take the long, bothersome route. The man's tone was as patronizing as ever. He then commented that he expected the son of Lord Kiba to look tougher, and with that slender body, he's sure the glorious Windamier family will end. The other two soldiers burst out laughing at his comments. Klaus could no longer stand their mockery and demanded he repeat what he just said. The man once again mocked Klaus, telling him that he has bad ears too. Delenz interrupted and told the men that they've gone too far, and if they say another word, they'll have to deal with him. Klaus stopped Delenz and defended himself. He asked the men if they think he can't perform his duties as a soldier just because of his slender arms. The soldier sipped his drink and replied with a wry smile that he didn't say that, only that it'll be difficult. Klaus stood up and put his hand on his sword that was slung around his waist. The soldier stopped the cup at his lips and stared at Klaus. Delenz swiftly intervened and stopped Klaus by telling him not to pay any attention to the words of drunken idiots. Klaus told Delenz that he won't stop and he refuses to back down. He then asked the men which of the three will be his opponent. The soldier who had been mocking Klaus stood up grinning and called Klaus a little boy, asking him if he's sure he wants to fight. Klaus replied that he's serious, and the soldier smugly responded if that's what he wants, but there's one thing he wants to ask first. Klaus asked what it was, and the soldier replied that he's General Kiba's son and he'll be in serious trouble if anything happens to him, so he needs to swear that he won't complain no matter what happens. Klaus said he understands and swore that no matter what happens, even if he dies, the soldier won't be held responsible. The soldier reminded Klaus not to forget those words, and Klaus responded that the soldier tarnished the Windamier family name. The soldier told Klaus to follow him into the forest. Delenz and the other two soldiers followed after them. Delenz had a worried look on his face and tried to talk Klaus out of it, but Klaus didn't respond as Chapter 2 comes to an end. Chapter 3. Chapter 3 opens with the fight having already begun. Klaus and the soldier were standing 20 steps apart and had already matched blades 3 times. Klaus's arms were beginning to feel numb and his breathing was heavy. The soldier, however, was smiling and staring at Klaus like a beast that found its prey. The soldier commented that he hoped the fight would be a little more rewarding and remarked how thin Klaus's arms were. Klaus responded that he won't say that when the fight is over, and the soldier mocked Klaus as his voice was shaking. The soldier rushed towards Klaus and Klaus assumed a defensive stance. Sparks flew as their swords collided. The soldier's sword was heavy and pushed Klaus's rapier back towards his own shoulder, which caused Klaus severe pain. Much to the surprise of the soldier, Klaus grit his teeth and endured through the pain. The soldier pulled back and Klaus stepped forward to attack, but the soldier easily stopped Klaus's attack. The two were now standing 10 steps apart. The more the two's blades clashed, the more the soldier got carried away in his arrogance. Klaus began thinking to himself how he's no match for the soldier, and he knew his skills were inferior, but he continued to desperately fight back. With Klaus tiring and breathing heavily, the soldier glared at him with a wicked smile and called him weak. The soldier stepped forward and to the left, swinging his sword upwards. Klaus tried to thrust his rapier forward to deflect the attack, but the force of the strike knocked Klaus's sword to the side. The soldier's attacks were relentless, striking from all angles, and Klaus could barely catch his breath. He managed to keep up with the soldier's attacks and noticed that the soldier's attacks were full of openings. The soldier attacked again, swinging his sword downward. Klaus tried to block the attack, but the impact sent a shock through his hand. The soldier pushed his sword down as hard as he could, and Klaus dropped to his knees. He tried to keep his balance, but his foot got caught in a small depression in the ground. Klaus fell to the ground but rolled out of the way to create some distance before counterattacking. The soldier dodged the attack by a hair's breadth. The soldier repositioned himself and asked Klaus if he's willing to admit defeat. Klaus was in pain and frustrated. He knew he was no match for the soldier and he began to question himself, wondering if he'll ever be like his father. Klaus then fell to his knees and bowed his head with his sword still poised. He'd been unable to land a single attack and even had to roll on the ground in the dirt. His opponent was treating him like an infant, and Klaus knew that if he was on a battlefield, he would have been the first one to be cut down. Delenz called out to Klaus, telling him that's enough and asking him to stop. Klaus momentarily thought about listening to Delenz's advice, but he couldn't bring himself to admit defeat and acknowledge the soldier's mocking words about his family. As Delenz approached Klaus, a gust of wind blew and almost extinguished the flame of his torch. A strategy flashed through Klaus's mind as their vision was momentarily obscured by the darkness. Delenz knelt in front of Klaus and advised him to give up. Klaus exhaled heavily and told Delenz to stand back. He admitted he's no match for the soldier in swordsmanship, but he refuses to give up and he refuses to lose as he wished to catch up to and surpass his father. Klaus stepped towards the soldier, who asked him if he wants to continue. Klaus responded by telling the soldier that as long as he's alive, he won't win. The soldier replied that he didn't intend the fight to go this far and reminded Klaus of his words earlier that he wouldn't be held accountable even if Klaus died. Klaus agreed and said he intends to honor his words. The soldier then raised his sword and told Klaus that he'd kill him just as he wishes. Klaus began wiping his left eye with his sleeve and kept his eye closed. The soldier grinned and asked Klaus if he's starting to cry and commented that he'd forgive him if he apologized. Klaus replied that it's just sweat in his eye. The soldier again mocked Klaus that even his eyes are beginning to give up on him. He then charged Klaus while taunting him, but instead of defending the soldier's attack, Klaus stepped backwards and retreated. The soldier again taunted him, calling him a boy and telling him to run. The soldier once again attacked and Klaus again dodged and kept his distance. Klaus found it difficult to move with only one eye open, but he concentrated on the ground under his feet and the soldier's movements, but he also kept his attention on where Delenz was standing. The soldier was beginning to grow frustrated at Klaus avoiding his attacks and asked him if the Windamier family's pride is running and showing their backs to the enemy. Klaus responded that he's not running, he's still fighting, he's just making the soldier work for it. The soldier again rushed forward to attack Klaus and Klaus moved to the side. Klaus's back was now facing Delenz and the soldier was now looking squarely at the light of the torch Delenz was carrying. Klaus taunted the soldier to come at him, and as the soldier charged, Klaus counted the steps that separated them. 20 steps, 15 steps, and when it got to 10 steps, Klaus turned around and slashed the torch to put out the flame. The area was instantly enveloped in darkness and Klaus opened his left eye. The soldier struggled with the sudden darkness, but Klaus with his left eye had become accustomed to the darkness. The soldier stepped into a small depression in the ground and fell down, the same hole that Klaus had stepped in earlier. Everything was exactly as Klaus had planned. He stepped on the soldier's sword and swung his rapier. The soldier groaned as Klaus's rapier was at his throat. The soldier angrily called Klaus an underhanded little, but before he could finish speaking, Delenz relit the torch and the soldier smacked Klaus's sword away from his neck. Klaus sheathed his sword, telling the soldier that he lost and asking him to apologize for the things he said. The soldier angrily replied that Klaus is a master of nothing but his mouth before standing up and turning his back. Klaus demanded that he take back his words and apologize, but the soldier again refused, telling Klaus that he used a cowardly strategy because he couldn't win with a sword. He then said that everyone at camp will be stunned to hear of the cowardly tactics of the son of General Kiba as he returned to the camp with the other two soldiers. Klaus stood in silence. The soldier's words had cut deep. Klaus thought that if he aspired to be like his father, he should have fought fairly and died like a soldier. He wasn't afraid of dying, but he didn't want to lose, and he didn't want to admit that he didn't have his father's courage. That's why he tried to win by any means necessary. Delenz smiled proudly at Klaus and told him not to worry about the soldier's words, as the most important thing is to win the battle. Klaus refused the praise, telling Delenz that he didn't defeat the soldier with a sword and that the soldier said he used underhanded tactics. Delenz told Klaus that fighting is not just done with swords. Battles are won by strategies, and he won the battle with a different way of fighting and by using a different kind of power than his father. He added that there's nothing to be ashamed of and he should be proud of the way he fought. Klaus wondered to himself if someone with his skills and power could become a general and wondered if there'd be a place for someone like him. Delenz commented that it's getting cold and they should head back to the camp. Klaus removed the sword from his waist and handed it to Delenz. Klaus told him that he needs to be alone right now and asked Delenz never to tell his father about what just happened. Delenz glanced at Klaus's sword and returned to the camp alone. Klaus stood alone in the forest looking up at the moon with his head full of doubts. His wish to become a man like his father was beginning to crumble, and he once again questioned if he could become like his father. Not knowing what to do, Klaus began walking through the forest as thoughts of the fight he had just fought raced through his mind. He looked up at the sky and saw Reto Fortress illuminated by the light of the moon. Before he even realized what he was doing, he was running through the forest towards the fort on the mountain. The next moment, Klaus opened his eyes. He could hear his father asking if he was okay. Klaus asked where he was, and Kiba responded that he's back at the camp, that Delenz found him collapsed in the mountain and brought him back. With a mixture of worry and anger, Kiba asked him what he was doing in the mountain alone. Thoughts of his fight with the soldier came back and tears began to well up in his eyes. Kiba asked him what's the matter, but Klaus couldn't bring himself to answer. Delenz asked Klaus if he wanted to talk about it, but Klaus shook his head as he didn't want the soldiers to be punished. Klaus remembered how his father told him it was his dream to ride into battle with Klaus by his side. The thought of disappointing his father was unbearable to Klaus, but his head was now full of doubts about his dream. Delenz took his leave from the tent to allow Klaus and Kiba some privacy. Kiba told Klaus that he doesn't have to talk if he doesn't want to, but reminded him that he's his father, and if there's something he can't do by himself, or something he needs help with, he can talk to him. Klaus wiped away the tears that begun pouring down his face and told his father that he was trying to run up the mountain to Reto Fortress. Kiba asked him why he's so focused on the fort, and Klaus responded that he was aiming to be a good general just like him, and he thought that if he ran up to the fort, he'd be able to catch up to him. Wiping away the tears with his bandaged hands, Klaus then asked his father why can't he be like him? Why can't he be a general who protects the country like him? Kiba fell silent for a moment, crossing his arms and furrowing his brows. He opened his eyes and unfolded his arms, placing his hand on Klaus's as he told Klaus that he's happy he wanted to follow in his footsteps, and just hearing those words is enough for him. Kiba continued by telling Klaus he's not saying to give up. Kiba struggled for words and he was unable to finish a sentence. He smiled at Klaus with embarrassment, a smile Klaus had seen his father make towards his mother many times when he struggled to convey his feelings. Kiba finally found the words he wanted to speak. He told Klaus that the Windamier family is a house of soldiers and that his father before him was a soldier in the service of the Highland royal family. He told Klaus not to dwell on their family's past, as Klaus is not him, just as he is not Klaus, and that they each have their own way. Klaus asked his father if that meant he'd no longer be a Windamier. Kiba squeezed Klaus's hand tightly and told him not to misunderstand what he's saying. Kiba then asked Klaus what did he think he'd done when he found out that his own father died on the battlefield. Klaus looked at his father with a puzzled expression on his face. Kiba told him that he proudly went to retrieve his father's body as his father lived and died as a soldier, but when he returned home without his father, he cried in sadness. He asked Klaus if he understood what he's trying to say before telling Klaus that they're humans before they're soldiers. Kiba added that he's proud to have been born into a military family, but sometimes he resents it. He told Klaus not to worry, that the house you're born into doesn't choose the path you take, and advised Klaus to choose his own path that allows him to be proud of himself. Chapter 3 comes to an end as Kiba tells Klaus that both he and his mother are proud of him. Chapter 4. Chapter 4 begins with Klaus arriving back home. He wanted to stay with his father, but word had spread around the camp of his fight with the soldier, and he needed some time to think for himself. On his way back to Lorenwi, Klaus wondered what path he should choose and what the options were for people without any martial prowess. The first thing that came to mind was a Home Affairs officer who served in the castle. However, in Highland, the status of civilian officials was far below that of those who served as officers in the military. As the heir to the Windamier family, Klaus didn't want to do that to his family as they have a history of serving in the military, and he felt that he couldn't give up on his dream of being on the battlefield with his father. He remembered what Dolenz said to him after his fight with the soldier, that he won with a different way of fighting, and he remembered what his father said to him about choosing a path that allowed him to be proud of himself. Klaus arrived back at the mansion. He stopped at the entrance and dropped his bag to the floor. He wanted to see his mother, but he couldn't bring himself to go inside until he decided on a new path to follow. But just then, the front door opened and Eliza came outside. She asked Klaus what's going on and why he's back so early. Klaus hesitated for a moment, but told his mother everything that happened in the camp. Eliza then smiled and gave him a hug. Eliza told him that he shouldn't be in a hurry to find his own way and he can take as much time as he needs. She reassured Klaus by telling him that it doesn't matter if he can't wield a sword, he's her precious son, and as long as he chooses a path that makes him happy, that will make her happy too. Klaus couldn't help but realise that his mother had said the same thing as his father. Klaus then asked why the house is so quiet and wondered where his uncle Greg was. Eliza told him that Greg was called back to Harmonia due to reports of bandits along the border with the grasslands. Klaus asked his mother if she's been alone since then. Eliza smiled and told him how relieved she is to have him back. Klaus then asked if she had any troubles while he was away, and Eliza responded that her only troubles were thinking about him and his father. Klaus helped his mother to bed to get some rest and went to his room to unpack. He spotted the Heroes of Harmonia book his uncle Greg had gifted him on his desk. He quickly changed out of his travel attire and sat at his desk. He tried to put his hand on the cover, but his hand involuntarily stopped. This book depicted the stories of the bravest generals in Harmonian history, and Klaus knew that if he opened the book, he'd have another dream that was out of his reach. Klaus hesitated and questioned if he should read it or not, but managed to calm himself and opened the book. Because of how old and worn the book was, some of the pages were damaged and there were parts where the ink had faded, but before he knew it, he was immersed in the stories. Stories of how a general during the Harmonian Civil War defeated 3,000 rebels with just 500 cavalry. How a unit of 15 mountain guards used clever tactics to defeat bandits invading from the grasslands. The exploits of Morrow Blight, who was the captain of the Harmonian Royal Guard, and how he quelled the civil war that plagued Harmonia before founding the Highland Kingdom. Klaus knew these stories to a certain extent from the Highland adaptation he'd read, but the contents in the original book provided far more detailed accounts of the stories. The image of all these ancient heroes flashed in his head, and he began to think of his father Kiba, who fought off 3,000 men with just 100 men. Klaus took a deep breath, and the image of the moonlit Reto fortress came back to his mind. Full of pride for his father, but also saddened by the reminder that he couldn't be like his father, Klaus shed a tear and shook off the sadness. Klaus turned the page and tilted his head in surprise at a chapter he had never seen before. A chapter that had been removed from the Highland adaptation of the book, a chapter titled The Blind Strategist Solette. Klaus had heard of the role of strategist before, but it wasn't a role he ever considered, as his mind had always been set on riding into battle alongside his father. Generals of Highland were required to have both literary and martial skills, and the nation didn't have a habit of employing strategists, as the role was fulfilled by the generals themselves. Klaus hurriedly turned the page and began reading. The more he read about Solette, the more his heart began pounding. Solette was once a skilled swordsman who served a lord in a rural mountainous town. One day, bandits attacked, and after a devastating battle, his family and the noble family he served were killed, and Solette had both of his eyes cut out by the bandits. No longer able to wield a sword, Solette returned to his hometown but vowed to get his revenge. He spent several years honing his intelligence as a weapon and swore to reclaim his lord's stolen land. Along with his two younger brothers, Solette gathered 200 men to face off against a force of over 1,500 bandits who now controlled the land of his former lord. Despite being blind and outnumbered, Solette had no fear of the bandits and used his intimate knowledge of the terrain to his advantage. He sent his men out to scout the land, the state of the village, and to study the weather. On the evening of a stormy day, Solette finally made his move. He divided his troops into two groups. Klaus was stunned. While there were differences in troop numbers, the strategy was similar to what his father had done at Reto Fortress. Klaus wondered what kind of strategy Solette used and hurriedly turned the page to continue reading. Solette ordered one group to launch a surprise attack on the village and lure the bandits into a nearby mountain valley. When the bandits pursued, Solette sprung his trap. Solette had his men destroy a dam that he had been ordered to build by his lord many years ago to prevent mudslides. The destruction of the dam unleashed a landslide into the valley, burying many of the bandits alive and blocking the survivors from escaping while throwing the bandits outside of the valley into a state of disarray. Solette then ordered his second group of men to attack the village. Solette's men launched relentless attacks on the divided and panicked bandits. By sunrise, the surviving bandits had scattered and fled. Solette returned to the village and performed a head count. Of the 200 men who followed him, 180 survived. Thanks to his strategies, only 20 men had died during the battle. Klaus could feel his hands trembling with excitement. Even though Solette was blind and couldn't wield a sword, he possessed the power to win the battle. Klaus thought that if his father had someone like Solette with him at Reto Fortress, then he probably wouldn't have lost a single soldier. Kiba and Delenza's words once again ran through Klaus's mind. A different way of fighting, and a path you can be proud of. Klaus suddenly began imagining himself standing on the battlefield commanding soldiers next to his father. In his fight with the soldier at the camp, Klaus had lost with a sword, but won thanks to strategy. The way of the strategist was something he thought he could proudly pursue, but he had no idea how to become a strategist. Klaus turned the page to continue reading the story, and the chapter covering the blind strategist Solette ended by stating, Following his victory against the bandits, Solette was recruited by the Harmonian Central Army. After peace was brought to Harmonia, Solette retired from his duties and opened a school in Crystal Valley. The motto of his school would come to be, "Knowledge is power." Klaus felt a jolt run through his body as if he'd been struck by lightning. He recited the final paragraph of the chapter over and over again, and as he did, his body and mind became hot from excitement. Klaus finally found the path he wanted to follow. He vowed to become a strategist, and even though it's an overlooked profession in Highland, he swore to make everyone recognize it. Klaus wondered if Solette's school was still open and if his teachings were still being taught. He then excitedly ran out of his room, calling out to his mother to tell her that he finally knows what path he wants to take. And that's the end of Klaus Windamier's backstory. As I mentioned at the beginning, this backstory came from a short story titled Hope in the Darkness from the Genso Suikoden Short Story Collection 3 that released in Japan in December 2001. We're nearing the end and there are only 4 more character short stories to cover from the books. The 4 remaining short stories are Gremio's, Sasuke's, Templeton's and Flick and Odessa's. I'll put up a poll in a community post for you to vote on them. I guess only 3 short stories though, because I already covered Gremio's short story in depth in the History of the Scarlet Moon Empire and War of Succession videos, so I'm not exactly itching to make a standalone video of that. Anyway, if there are any other Suikoden or non-related Suikoden topics you want me to make videos on once we've finished working our way through the books, do let me know. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.